assessment of the Next Stage Arts Project, and we're really happy to have you here tonight. We are so pleased to be working in collaboration with Landmark College to present tonight's speaker from the Landmark Speaker Series, and we look forward to more of these events. I don't know, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, how many of you have never been to Next Stage before? Awesome. Welcome. So we're so glad to have all of you students from Landmark coming here, and I want to mention that we have speakers, we have movies, we have all kinds of music, we have theater, we have dance, and we're open to suggestions if there's stuff you would like to see happen here. A couple things I'll mention that you might be interested in. If you like bluegrass, we have a great bluegrass concert coming up on Sunday. Lonely Heartstring Band and the Stockwell Brothers. If you like rock and roll, we have the lead singer from the Saturday Night Live band, Christine Ullman, coming on Saturday, April 19th. You may have seen her. She was just on Jimmy Fallon last week, and she is a superstar. She's amazing. Come to that. And as I said, give us suggestions. But we're a very short walk or a shuttle ride down the hill. And we want you to come, we want your ideas, and we're so glad to have you here. We have a website and all kinds of stuff coming up on that, so take a look at that, nextstagearts.org. If you need a restroom, segueing from culture to more basic stuff, downstairs through the first floor through the kitchen, we have that. We have exits if you need to leave. And we have the next person I would like to introduce, who's going to introduce our great speaker tonight. I do just want to say a special thank you to Jeff Burgess, who's doing such a great job with your speaker series at Landmark. It's a pleasure to work with, and we look forward to working with him a lot more. Again, thanks so much for coming, and please welcome Liza Burns.
As Maria mentioned, I'm Liza Burns. I am the Communications Department Chair at Landmark College, and I'm very happy to be here. It's really exciting to see all of you students here. I see most of you have made it down the hill, and also equally exciting and welcoming to the Putney community. We're really excited to be collaborating with Next Stage and the Landmark College Speaker Series. For those of you who may not be aware of it, the Academic Speaker Series is an amazing series that Maria mentioned, headed by Jeff Burgess, which I would like to take just a moment to hours and hours of details to bring to Putney some amazing speakers, as evidenced in tonight's speaker, Virginia Prescott. The speaker series runs all year long, and they're typically held up at Landmark College, and they are free and open to the public. So we would really welcome you to check out the Landmark website and see who's coming up. We're already very excited for the next lineup. But the reason we're all here tonight is for Virginia Prescott. As many of you know, Virginia is the host of the show Word of Mouth, the sound of new ideas on New Hampshire Public Radio. Prior to New Hampshire Public Radio, Virginia was editor and producer for nationally syndicated programs On Point and Here and Now, both produced at WBUR in Boston. I'll need to cut out some of her bio. Okay. So some things you may not know about her, though. Throughout her radio career, Virginia helped set up independent radio stations in developing regions in southern and West Africa. She also trained journalists in post-conflict zones from Sierra Leone to former Yugoslavia. She was awarded a Loeb Fellowship from Harvard University, where she studied how broadcast media could spark dialogue to build community across hostile borders. In tonight's talk, Virginia will use examples from her career in broadcasting to talk about how active listening, a phrase we use often at Landmark College, active listening can change personal and communal dynamics to be used as a tool to move beyond conflict. I'm a huge fan, and I'm quite honored to call her a friend. Please welcome Virginia Prescott.
Thank you so much, Liza and Jeff and the Landmark. A beautiful room, which I can no longer see, unfortunately. But thank you all for being here, students, faculty, and staff at Landmark, for this spectacular welcome, and I'm really glad that you're all here. We are going to speak about listening tonight because I believe it is a lifeline. It's something that connects all of us. I'm not going to teach you how to listen. That's not necessarily something I can do, but maybe give you some good reasons why to listen. Listening to stories is thought to be one of the reasons for the success of our species. Stories told in early tribes like this happy tribe that you see here told each other stories warning of danger, and it also helped to communicate a sense of belonging. There were tribal rules contained within these stories, and a way to cohere some shared knowledge. So I'm going to appeal to you to think about listening now, some 13 to 15,000 years later, in an era where noise is absolutely everywhere. When you go to fill up your gas at the gas pump, you get a broadcast. At the checkout counter, you get a broadcast. There are airwaves everywhere, whether we're seeking them out on our phone, looking at the internet. Everything is pushing for our attention. And this is at the same time that spoken conversation is diminishing. And many of us do talk with each other, right, by using our texts. I'm not saying that that is bad at all. I'm not saying, that technology is bad and we shouldn't have sound, but propose that active listening to the voices of others and stories unlocks parts of our own mind and our own imagination. Our brains are actually hardwired to form pictures when we hear sounds. Images that are dictated to the brain, say when you're watching television or movies, those are things that you're receiving in a very different part of your brain than when you're listening. When you're listening, you're activating centers that create images. And these are actually very close to pleasure centers in your brain. So listening is actually perceived as something very pleasurable to the brain. So let's see how that might work for us. I'm going to be playing some audio tonight. A lot of people prefer to listen with their eyes closed. You can do as you choose. All of them are about 2 minutes long.
This is WNYC 93.9 FM, AM 820, and online at WNYC.org. It's 8:51. Good morning, I'm Mark Hyland. As we told you just moments ago, there has been some sort of an incident at the World Trade Center, an apparent accident involving an airplane of some type. We have an eyewitness to the explosion at the World Trade Center this morning in the Northern Tower. Charlie Hines works for WNYC. Charlie, tell us what you saw as an eyewitness.
Mark, unbelievable, airplane flying apparently out of control. It appeared to be an American Airlines plane. And I thought, flying through Newark, gosh, that's so low.
Thinking of what people will say. We're doing it just for the money. But it's not that. We were hurt as kids. They hurt us. And it can never be fixed.
About what they heard or anything that it triggers for you?
Something I didn't want to hear, that's for sure.
Sorry?
I think we can all guess what that was.
Well, it was a moment that triggers something, I think. Obviously it triggered something in you. And part of the point of that montage is that it's either sound that I gathered or got. I was working at WNYC at that time, or created. And what I think it brings up is that listening is transporting. It does. It's a medium of feeling. It triggers emotion. It triggers imagination. You hear something. You see something in your brain. So I want to talk about what that has inspired for me, which is my career in broadcasting. Actually, does anyone know what broadcasting means? Does you know where the original origin of that term? Come on, Vermonters. Yes, thank you very much. It's to spread seed. A farmer would walk along in his plowed field and just cast the seeds out as far as he could, cover as much ground as he possibly could, not knowing what might actually take hold. And that, I feel like, has been a real metaphor for my career of making radio and sounds and stories. Some of the most meaningful work for me has been working with and training journalists and creating sustainable radio stations and networks in fledgling democracies and in post-conflict zones. These are places that don't have a strong tradition of journalism or radio. I first saw this in West Africa. That's where this photograph was taken. In countries where literacy is very low, where television penetration is very spotty, government's highly centralized and very powerful, radio there is an extremely penetrating medium. It's the primary medium that most people get their information from. And this was in Senegal. I was in Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, and Mali. And this is Radio Pinchme. And that is the Wolof word for the gathering tree inside of villages, inside of their village, where people would come and talk about what was going on with them, try and resolve some of their conflicts, or tell stories. So Radio Pinchme in Senegal was kind of like a virtual gathering tree. It became a place where people could listen even if they were a little further away. The first season that this was on the air, the first rainy season, there were 40% fewer cases in malaria just in that precinct, just in that first year, because people had a little bit more information about not keeping standing water out, about when to put their mosquito nets on, about places where you could go for inoculation or drugs to fight malarial diseases. And these are things that were just sort of passed around word of mouth before then, and a lot of misinformation gets communicated in that way, except on the radio program. This was also the place with the highest voter turnout that year. And these kind of statistics are consistent over 5 years, because I was actually doing this work in the late 90s. That's when I started doing it. So we got some measurements for the last 5 years. There is, improvements in infant mortality rates, measurably, fewer women dying during childbirth, more children in school in precincts with community radio. And that means not government radio. This is something that's generated from inside of the community. It's also introduced a whole new constituency for women, women's programming, and that's probably because a lot of these radio stations are funded with some help from international NGOs, and they know that the health of women and the lives of women are critical to communities. So you rarely heard these women's voices in the public sphere. I'm going to play something that was just recorded. I got it off the internet from last week. It is a male host still, but the subject is still a woman. So this woman goes on, she's talking about her husband died, leaving her with 2 very young children, too young to farm the parcel of land that he actually left them. So her husband's older brother has been using the land himself, giving her only 1 bag of millet a year for the privilege. And she's saying that, I did not translate this, I translated from the French, but it's actually in Wolof. She's saying that she's not being allowed to access land to farm or to live. She wants to live there. So these are the kind of conversations or problems that used to be discussed in very small circles, not having a wide range of communication. But this is something, especially women's voices have come out a great deal in these small developing countries and African radio stations. This other photograph is from Radio Anfani in Niamey in Niger. Up behind her head, I don't know how well you can see it, it's a record, but it's a broken record. And Anfani tried to build a radio station out in the eastern parts of the country where the uranium mines are, because there's really no news sources out there other than what people are being told by the mining companies. And government thugs came and broke it up. And so that is a sort of remnant of this broken up station that they put up as a symbol of persistence and defiance and a right to access unbiased community-generated information. So that's the voice of Otis Redding. And one of the voices that figures into the studies of a cultural critic and broadcaster named Susan Campbell. She gathered a great deal of research supporting the idea that it was black music, race music as it was called in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, channeled across America, and these big AM radio stations actually helped lay the foundation for the civil rights movement. This, I believe, is one of the things that music and voices can do. The voice of Otis Redding and so many other black artists penetrated the soul, somehow got into the thinking of the people who were living in the South or living in other places and had maybe never met anybody who was an African American. And the idea was that this humanized them somehow. You know, they went from this kind of abstraction to something that, oh, if he can feel those kind of emotions and have those kind of feelings, and he can make me feel the same thing, or she, then there must be something more than I'm being told. There must be a connection to my humanity. It made it less opaque. So how can we use this in contemporary America is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. A realization that I had when I was a reporter in New York City was that people could tell their stories better than I could tell their stories. My job was just to get out of the way as much as possible. And I joined up with the people who were forming the Radio Rookies program at that point. It's basically training kids to make stories, to carry diaries, and record themselves and their lives, and talk about their own experiences in the environment in New York City. And one of our first groups was in Hunts Point in the Bronx. And to give you a little background on Hunts Point, it is a high crime and poverty area. It has been for many, many years. It's part of the poorest congressional district in the country. Over half the population live below the poverty line. It's the highest violent crime rate per capita in New York City, also extremely high incarceration rates, prostitution, and it's notorious for its drug industry, which means that many addicts actually live in the community. These are, we just heard the statistics, right? So this brings us some of the faces of those addicts who are living in the Bronx. These are by the photographer named Michael Zhang. He's actually a banker by trade, but he's an amateur photographer and has gone around in the Bronx and other neighborhoods taking photographs of addicts and listening to their stories. And he says, I'm not a journalist, I'm not verifying anything, I just listen to them. So these are ways that we can witness. That's what my thinking was with Radio Rookies, talking to kids in a similar way, hearing their stories. The teens in Hunts Point, and we did many neighborhoods after Hunts Point, I'm just giving you this example, talked about sexuality, they talked about family, they talked about money and friendships and drugs, and in this case, drug addiction in the family. This is Janice Nieves. Her father's a heroin addict, and in her radio diary, she tells us that he once made her pee in a bottle. She had no idea why, and figured it out that he needed a clean urine sample. So that's the kind of relationship that she had with her father, who she remembered with great affection. She's always been a kind of big kid, and she says he used to help push her over this fence that they used to go to for a playground. So Janice brings her radio diary along. She talks to her mother, who says, your father, Poppy, left both of us when you were in elementary school for heroin. She talks to her brother and her friends, and she also talks to some experts on drug abuse and addiction. And she tries a couple of times to talk to her father. Finally, we're going to hear just a little bit of a clip of her actually having that conversation when she finally reaches him. And I'm going to put those faces of the addicts back up, because I think it's maybe a way to think about the narratives that may lie behind all of these faces, maybe giving us a sense of the lives of people who are hooked and those whose lives they affect.
Let's pray somebody's there. I just want to talk. This time, Poppy was there. While he was in the bathroom, I saw his shopping cart. He said, you got a Pepsi, some King Cobra beer, and a square box. It's kind of stinky, so I want to walk away. When he finally came out the bathroom, I went at it. I wasted no time. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good.
Are you serious?
Yes.
But I mean, a heroin addict, that makes you feel good?
Yes.
So, how do you feel when I see you like this?
See me like what?
What makes you want to go and get cans from the garbage and take it to the supermarket? I mean, what makes you want to do that?
Because I have my money.
But that's not the only way you can make money.
No, which other way?
Well, you can get clean and, get other jobs.
But I got it.
No, I don't. Okay, that's the wrong word. I'm sorry. I'm talking about you doing drugs and thinking it's okay. Or why you can't just go into a program? Why you gotta keep doing it and keep doing it? I know it's addicting, but why you gotta keep doing it? My plan was to go in there and let Bobby know that I love him. And I wanted to help. But I let my anger take over instead.
No matter what, you supposed to love me, we there, If you're gonna be there, you're gonna be,
If you was healthier, trust me, I'll be here every day. But I'm not gonna sit here and look at you knowing that you do it, and I'm not gonna say anything about it. I'm not gonna stay shut because it's not right. Don't you know that this can kill you? Does that even,
Anything can kill you nowadays. Anything can kill you.
He had that, whatever attitude. Fine, I was telling him the truth. And he didn't want to hear it. So it just ended.
I want to talk about it. The drug issue is out.
So that's it, that's me now.
That's the interview. Yes.
Are you mad?
No, I'm not.
I just stood there for a long time. After all that, like nothing happened. Bobby told me he wanted to buy me some cookies.
I know, I want to buy something.
But he didn't have the money.
For you.
So that's Janice, a young woman I found tremendously courageous and maybe giving us just a little glimpse into the lives of those huge numbers and growing numbers of heroin addicts. I know that this is a real problem in Vermont. I don't know if anyone saw the series in the New York Times about that, but maybe there are stories there to be had as well. I'm going to continue with this DIY radio theme. This is not something that I produce. This is Joe Richmond. He runs a company called Radio Diaries and has produced loads of fantastic diaries of teens and people on death row. He's got a lot of different interests. This is the prison diaries, and the idea was that they gave tape recorders to 5 inmates and 4 correctional officers and a judge, and for 6 months they kept audio journalists and journals and recorded the sounds and scenes of everyday life behind bars. Shakedowns, roll calls, chow hound visits, and often quiet moments at night inside of the cell at the Polk Institution in Raleigh, North Carolina, like this young man, John. John Mills, 21-year-old inmate. By the time he was 17 years old, he committed 75 armed robberies. He's been convicted, and he's been doing, did I say 7 and 9? He mostly records at night by himself, but we do hear a lot of different interactions with other people in the prison. It sounds in many ways like he's trying to make a change in prison, but also there's the real pull of the thrill of being a criminal.
I wanted to be a police officer, you know what I'm saying? When I was small, I used to think about that all the time, be a police officer. All the sirens, loud noises, blue lights and stuff. But now I hate the police. I know my life just took a big turn somewhere. I just don't know where. Robbing people was fun. Not like I'm proud of it or nothing. But when I was out there, I did love the thrill of it myself. And the look is always the first thing you get once you put the gun in their face. I always point the gun to the head, surprise, and then they frozen. I love that look in their eyes. I love that when I was out there because, I don't know, I really can't explain it. It makes you feel, hey, I got him.
Just wondering if there were any impressions of John. Does he sound like he really wasn't proud of it? I think this is one of the things that audio diaries kind of reveal. If you give someone a tape recorder, they lose that self-consciousness, and maybe you hear this balance between trying to puff themselves up and making them sound like the person they're you want to hear or they think you want to hear and projecting. But it also gets to this thing that Henry James called felt life, you know, this unidealized self, this imperfect self that reveals things that may not even be apparent to them. So these are some traditional broadcast media examples of trying to get to people's voices who rarely get heard. The question is, how do you do it inside of a community, outside of that broadcast media? People who often don't have voices don't have access. That's what brought me to Project Row Houses. That's Rick Lowe. He's the actual, this isn't from the New York Times. The New York Times did a piece on the cover story of the living section, calling it perhaps the most successful art project in the country. It was really an amazing experience to work with Rick. He's an artist who had this vision of social sculpture, that we can create, that we as artists can create the world that we want to and shape it in the way that we want to. To give you some background on the Project Row Houses, it's in the 3rd Ward in Houston, Texas. And it was once a booming center of life for African Americans especially. You know, chicken shacks, the El Dorado Ballroom, this place called Dowling Street that had record stores and barber shops. It was humming, as you'll hear somebody say. And after desegregation, people moved out because they could. And then in a move that happened in a number of African American urban centers, they built a highway right through the middle of it. So it blocked off the patterns of people's walking and kind of left it as marginal land. They figured it was marginal land anyway. And then the crack epidemic of the 90s left it pretty much boarded up and deserted. So Rick and a bunch of artists had this idea that we could take these houses and turn them into something. They together bought 21 row houses that were all sort of in a block, and that life was in the backyard of these houses. And through volunteers and Habitat for Humanity and a little grant funding and a lot of elbow grease, they fixed up these houses into 21 different houses. And 7 of them for after-school programs, 7 are for a young mother's program where you can have, if you're a woman going to school and you have dependent children, you can stay there for up to 2 years rent-free. It's, of course, competitive to get in there, but you have a great environment to bring them up in. And then 4 of the houses were set up as artist installations. So every 6 months, a new artist comes in and kind of takes over the house and does something with them, does something that either reflects the neighborhood or their own work or whatever. And they sort of created this oasis inside of this neighborhood that was long ago left for dead, with all of these kind of active programs there. So I was there as a visiting artist, and I worked with kids to interview their elders and record the memories that seemed to be fading along with these buildings. I did not use kids this young. I didn't work with them, but he was so adorable that I had to put this picture. But the goal was to hear the stories that weren't necessarily, you know, something that would be in the official marker in the neighborhood association or catalog or something like that, but the lived life, the quotidian, you know, to create this audio image of a time when the 3rd Ward was a fancy place, as somebody told me, with great dignity, as another person said. So I have a montage of just a few that we use for a program on KPFT, because a lot of the volunteers worked with me at that local community radio station, KPFT.
It was a 24-hour street, Jack. I mean, folks did. I mean, they walked up and down the street. There was, you know, a lot of beer lounges. It had the El Dorado. That was the biggest thing Black has ever seen.
Hello, Cap. I just got back, and I'm looking for that place they call the Chicken Shack. They say it's fine as wine, and it's really on the ball. No windows, no doors, it's just a hole in the wall.
I mean, down the street, they talk about deep down. There are either 1 or 2 things that could happen to you. You either made it with a lady, or you got yourself killed.
Then the clubs weren't integrated, and the people that called themselves the big shots went to the silk stocking clubs.
I was afraid to come to 3rd Ward. Living in the 5th Ward area, in 3rd Ward, I had heard so much it's so up to date, you know, and fancified, and all big shots and blues singers be in there.
Back in those days, times wasn't, it was tight, but we was full, and we had a roof over our head.
any work that was drawing people. I think it was just getting away from some kind of work, you know. Too much cotton to pick, too much corn to pull, too much cane to cut. You know, at least in Houston, you had some kind of freedom.
Oh, there's a place with the lights coming through the wall. You better be mighty careful. Let's have a ball. Come on, all you fellas, and take a drink from my back, 'cause the party's ready to start down at the Chicken Shack.
So we did a number of these themes that was kind of a montage of them about how things were back then in terms of street life and home life and work life and what the buildings were like and what the environment looked like, and we turned this into an installation we're calling Row Houses. It's kind of like a talking house, and the idea was to have a place to go and sit and hear these stories. And we set up motion sensors, and I'll give you just a little sample of this. And this, again, was filmed by not a professional photographer, but I'll let the lady at the end explain it. So you hear this woman humming and sweeping the floor first. And these are the little triggers that when you pass by them, they will trigger different sort of strings of stories. And we put the pictures of the people who lived there, mostly, and some contemporary people, up in these screens, so they were a little ghostly. So this chest of drawers, basically, when you open up the first shelf, you got the story of this woman, Ruby Rusk. And the bottom drawer is the story of this man, Cleveland Turner, a folk artist that was known as the Flower Man. I'll tell you more about his story. One of the things that struck me when I first visited row houses is that inside of all these houses, there were all these old voices and all these old stories trapped inside of them, and that there have been histories lived here and lives lived here that hadn't been heard for a long time. And because we now have the technology, we can hear people's stories and sort of bring them to life. And that was my goal in working with the kids at KPFT and in the Project Greenhouse after school program to teach them how to capture those voices in those lives. So what we did here is we gathered a bunch of stories and talked to people about what their lives were like if they were living in the third ward, and some of them actually living in these row houses, and heard how they came here, how their families came here, and what they did for the living, and what their daily life was like, what the life on the street was like, and recorded them, and then pieced them together and created this installation. And the idea is that the voices and the stories are activated by when people come in, sort of like if they have attention, if they have a listening ear, then you can hear the stories. So that's what the idea is here when people walk in. Okay, so I explained that bit about you. This is the Flower Man.
You know, at that time. If I would have went, I would have felt better. just take me home. What is I'm living for? And I was so uncivilized, I couldn't stand up here and look at you. I was just been out in the weed patch so long, I was just like a wild horse, you know. About 3 o'clock in the morning, laying down in the hospital bed, and this big pretty thing just come up going around like a whirlwind going in my head. Just a clear trail standing up there. Just jump, and people were just looking like they were in stage, you know, at this big pretty thing. Just coming and going back to jump, as I call it. So that's what I tried to make, that vision in my head. That's the reason why this is back color and the flowers and let me set roof.
So Cleveland Turner was a hopeless skid row drunk for many, many, many years. That's how he describes himself. Until a woman found him nearly dead, called the hospital. They took him away. And that, in the hospital, is where he had this vision. You know, he was probably really having the delirium tremors. But he had this vision of this beautiful, whirling thing of color, and he was going to build it. And he said if he got sober, if he got out, he was going to build it. And he became a folk artist, really well known. Like Greyhound buses used to come up to his house and show off the work that he'd done. It got totaled after Hurricane Ike, and he built a new one. He actually just died last year. So that's just one of the stories that's kind of trapped away and activated by our listening. So in this other drawer is a woman named Ruby Rusk. She was a 17-year-old chambermaid at a Shreveport hotel who wanted to be a nurse back in 1945. She couldn't afford to go to nursing school. And she was staying there one day, she was working one night, and the head of what was then Standard Oil came and asked her to work in New York. Here's her version of the story.
So I was turning the beds back on, because in the hotel you turn the beds back on Sunday nights, we got the big wheels up coming in. So Mr. Cullen was sitting at the desk. Wouldn't you like to go to New York to work for me and my wife and my 2 children? I said, I don't know, sir. I've never been out of town. I don't know whether my parents will allow me to go. And I got to check on my job here to see if they will allow me to go. They started calling Mama like they was across the street. And they was in New York City. That was back in 1945. 45. I had to get on the train. Daddy took the truck and put me down there on the train. 5:20. I was late. So Mrs. McCollum was out. She's a big white girl, kind of an Irish girl. Do you have a Ruby Rusk on this train? I said, yes, ma'am. So she, I'm Mrs. McCollum. I come for you. You're going to work for me now. By the hand, I got in her limousine, and we went on out to 791 car. New York was so dangerous, so dark and dreary looking to me. I thought, what? I hope I survive.
She's so lovely. She worked for the family for 30 years. They merged with Conoco, and she raised their children. And after Mr. McCollum died, he didn't leave her anything. It was just a sad, sad tale. I'm going to move along. I've got a couple of more oral history stories, but I think I want to get to this idea of conflict resolution. Stories can be a healing force, not only in these urban communities, but I think in a larger sphere as well. I mentioned that I've worked in the Balkans, or Liza did, Liberia, Sierra Leone, where access to good information helped fuel the conflicts. There were people in isolated areas, like in Rwanda. Maybe you've heard of the radio station Mille Collines that broadcast messaging to kill. One of the things that actually fueled the genocide and monitored it along the way. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the conflict. It was a war, this civil war in Sierra Leone, of absolute abject brutality, characterized by amputations and by the use of child soldiers. This was the first time it became really well known on the international scale. Quick background on the conflict. It was all about diamonds. That's what this boy is sifting for. The Liberian president, this country next door, wanted to quell a rebellion in his own country, and he needed arms. And diamonds are the primary currency for arms smuggling in the black market because they're very small. They can be transported very easily. You cannot register. You can't figure out where they came from. They're absolutely untraceable. And of course, they're worth a whole lot. So President Charles Taylor found it pretty easy because the social conditions in the civil society was so poor in Sierra Leone that he could easily sort of foment rebellion and discontent. And he especially did that around the diamond mining areas, and the idea was that they would contain them. There were places there where there were international diamond mining companies there, places where the Sierra Leone government was actually protecting them with mercenaries, which was a real disaster. But the whole idea that poor populations were far from information, far from government reach, and they were getting massacred, village by village by village. The control consolidated by the diamond mines started spreading toward the capital. And by that time, the rebellion had taken on other proportions. All of the sort of ideas of discontent that had been simmering for a long time just took off. They grew, the rebels, fighting sometimes with against international mercenaries, sometimes with and against, or sometimes against rather, UN blue helmets, were just brutalizing the population. At one point in about 1994, midway in the conflict, the president of Sierra Leone said, "Let's all join hands for Sierra Leone," and in just a macabre show of power, they delivered bags and bags and bags of amputated hands to the capital. It's just a brutal, brutal war. In the end, 70,000 had been killed, more than 2/3 of the population had been displaced, an estimated quarter of those who were soldiers were under 18 years of age. And girls were made into bushwives. I mean, the girls did not escape it. So such atrocities were really commonplace across the country. A very uneasy peace was formed in 2001, 2002. They had to disarm 72,000 soldiers and place them among the population. Many people in the area told me that, yes, we buried the hatchet, but we marked the spot. You know, the contempt was that close to the surface. But people were fatigued. They had been terrorized. They were ready to put the war behind them and to start working in a functioning democracy. This guy is actually going to vote. So I worked with Search for Common Ground. This is an international NGO that works with conflict resolution programming. And I was trying to figure out if it were feasible to build a network of independent community stations for programming conflict resolution and for news and for building a civil society. This group called Talking Drum Studio was funded by Search for Common Ground, and they were producing programs like something called Atunda Allende, which means lost and found. They were distributing it on cassette all across the country. So anyway, this program was phenomenally popular, and it was just one of many programs that were sort of modeling new ways of living together and having dialogue. So in Atunda Allende, the characters were like, you know, a former soldier, an amputee, a former child soldier, a Commodore warrior, who were the kind of like nativists who were fighting against them, people who were civilians who'd lost their homes, and they're all sort of in this play acting skit, and it's weekly. They make it current. They update it every single week to talk about things that are really going on inside of the country. I'm going to play you just a little clip from it. This is in Pidgin English, so you probably recognize a couple of the words.
Yes, I don't really know the formula for solving tax problem. I don't know.
But the civil society the only thing for solving tax wahala. I'm not worried about that.
I don't fed up with one old tax problem. I don't fed up. Now all the money they go on, let's make money talk.
We not go know, but we get plenty confidence about it.
That very civil society they live. They're not serious at all.
So everybody knew who these characters were. They could talk about what happened with them because radio was a predominant medium. People, when I was driving sometimes along with people in the Talking Drum Studio truck, they were jumping up in the street and sort of yelling because the program was so popular, because it had given them a way, I think, to experience dialogue between these groups that hadn't spoken to each other in so long, and given them a way to talk about things that you know, they had a lot more nuance than the government decrees that were coming down at them all the time. It gave them a precedent and a language and a way to talk about conflicts. It could be heated, certainly, as you heard. You know, there's no sort of disguising it, but not erupting into argument or violence. Just a couple pictures here. This is down here on the bottom left is Radio Moa. This is in Kailan. This is the place where the first shots of the revolution with the Civil War were actually fired. And those are some people working at the Radio Moa. So, I was realizing, as I was sort of going back and forth to Africa and coming back, I was living in New York City initially and working in interactive media and thinking, oh, we're going to change the whole media paradigm, the internet will be owned by everybody, and that was in the early days. And I applied for this fellowship and moved to this liberal bastion of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I lived there for 6 years. And I remember after, I don't know if anyone has maybe experienced a similar thing here, but after Bush's second election, which some may argue was the first, but he, people walking around the street thinking, where do I live? How do I not notice America? Am I in a bubble? I mean, people were going crazy. And it was just really interesting to sort of like see how people inside of their own circle spoke with each other. And I realized that for myself, going home to my family, there were things that we absolutely could not talk about because it would erupt into an argument. And we kind of thought we were all adults by saying, we're just not going to have that kind of conversation right now. The problem when you're listening and having a dialogue and a conversation is that you may not win. So I began to think about ways to, how could we model conversation here? What could work here? And, not as some kind of throwback to the old vaudevillian days, when we had radio plays kind of thing was not what I was thinking about, but a way forward as the rancorous voices and the combatant kind of entertainment was growing. How could we do this as we're going forward? So my process, and what I'm advocating for you today, is to consider what prevents us from really listening. And how can we consider what it means to listen? I can feel my own resistance to hear someone else's story if I don't agree with it, or just think it's probably false, or I think they don't know as much as they should know, or whatever. And that's something that becomes a discipline that I have to work with. So I discovered this model. It was a really interesting model in what was called the Public Conversations Project. Now this had been going on since, I don't know if you remember when in Brookline, Massachusetts, there was a Planned Parenthood bombing in 1996. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Anyway, after that, the groups, anti-abortion rights and pro-abortion rights groups in the Boston area started talking with each other. And they did it in complete secrecy because this stuff could not get out as far as they were concerned. They went public about their conversations after 6 years in a Boston Globe op-ed. And NPR's Margot Adler interviewed them in 2003. Now here are just two of the participants.
There were many different levels. One of the most serious to me was the fact that if people within the pro-life community knew that I was doing this, they might think that I was somehow or other sort of sitting with the enemy, so to speak, and that I was sort of a traitor to the pro-life movement. So that was a concern at a very deep level for me. That's not what I was doing, but perception is very important, really, in public policy type issues.
First of all, we came to develop a real affection for each other. Also because it was very intellectually stimulating. You were forced to really dig down very deep to say why you believed what you believed.
What was really interesting about these women, and it was only women, I think, at least initially, meeting, is that it didn't change their point of view a whit. In the public sphere, neither of them crossed over, as they say. But their families got to know each other. They hung out with each other. They spent time with each other. And in fact, some of them said that it strengthened their views. But it demonstrated that one could stand one's ground with civility. You didn't have to hate the enemy. This, unfortunately, is the way that most people listen. This is from Fran Lebowitz, kind of bon vivant in New York City writer. The opposite of talking isn't listening. The opposite of talking is waiting. So many of us, we can't wait to get what we have to say out. So we're just kind of like, hurry up so I can do my thing, or before I forget it. And the art of listening actively is not sitting on your hands and waiting. Maybe it's sitting on your hands, but sitting on your hands and taking it in. And this is, this is part of our cultural value. In the knowledge economy, we just want to get there first. We want to be ahead of the crowd. We want to control our message, many times to flatter ourselves in the public sphere. We have this huge, huge space that allows for a zillion different voices, and we want to get ours out there, and we want it to matter, and we want to say something, and we want to say something profound. Conscious listening means connecting to the messiness of our uncurated self. Giving this idea that we know how things are going to go, what the result is going to be. I spoke to this woman, Sherry Turkle, she's from MIT. She was a big proponent of internet culture, especially in the late 1990s, and wrote all about it in the early part of this decade, last decade. She wrote this book, Alone Together, a couple years ago, and kind of changed her tune. She said, we expect more from technology and less from each other, because there is vulnerability in needing each other. And we are all vulnerable, and we are all alone. So we are designing technologies which give us the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. She expanded on this a little bit in a TED Talk.
People want to be with each other, but also people want to customize their lives. They want to go in and out of all the places they are, because the thing that matters most to them is control over where they put their attention. So you want to go to that board meeting, but you only want to pay attention to the bits that interest you. And some people think that's a good thing. But you can end up hiding from each other, even as we're all constantly connected to each other.
Okay, so everybody gets this slide, apparently. So the question is, how can we use this technology that's in front of us to better get to this compassion and community and context that I've been talking about tonight, or that you've hopefully heard a little of tonight? Here's one project, the Yellow Arrow Project. It's a street art project connecting strangers, and the idea is that participants put these colored yellow stickers with codes, and they geotag the locations, and then they tell a little bit of a story about them. Right now it's all text. As of 2012, the Yellow Arrow has been working on doing audio, because as we've talked about tonight, sometimes that can have a whole different effect on the way that you think about somebody. So every little arrow becomes a story with a life and a conversation of its own. The streets become the media in some way. The reporters are the audience, and you and me. People are doing similar things, tagging trees, for example, in San Francisco, tagging breeds of trees and saying what they are, telling little stories about them, or saying that this one really needs help, and trying to alert the city authorities to them. It's also being done in Los Angeles, where everybody's supposed to have access to the beach, but a lot of people with very wealthy properties block them off and say private property. So people are leaving these little geotags and telling stories about, well, you can go here. I mean, this is all internet culture. This is all stuff that you have probably been hearing similar things about. But the question is how to put them into a way that we can hear another human voice. I think most of us use our technology in complete silence. Maybe we're listening to something, but we're looking at it, There's not a conversation going on there. So if there's any takeaway here, ask, what would it mean for me to be a better listener to the world around me, and to the people, and to the environment, and even to the buildings that we pass through every single day? And how can we hear from each other? Maybe you can say, okay, today's Monday. I've had 3 conversations lasting less than 30 seconds with people. Maybe I'm going to improve that on Tuesday. Or maybe have a conversation with somebody that you may pass by and be curious about and want to know a little better, or just hear something about them, just to show them interest. That's one of the things, like pulling out those drawers. You're just activating the story in some kind of way. And of course you have to be willing to listen, because some people have an awful lot to say. So I would like to say again that our whole species has survived by listening to the stories of others. So what are some of the creative ways that we might be able to connect with other stories, other voices, to hear others and to engage and to risk? Because I think it is kind of a risk. It's a risk for us to stay in our own sort of safe little anonymous world behind the screens, looking at a screen, and not really hearing another person. So how can we harness this technology to listen and engage? And how can we capture stories and maybe put them out there? Scatter that seed that we were talking about. As you know, you never know what's going to happen where it lands. Now, I look forward to hearing what you think and what you come up with. And I really thank you for your attention tonight, because, as you may have heard from me, I really do believe that listening is a bit of an act of love. And It is the kind attention of one to listen to another. So I thank you for listening to me.
It was the sort of independent, you record yourself from
Radio diaries? Yeah.
Radio diaries.
Yeah.
How do you get into that? How do you start?
The big picture, okay. Well, that was a program that was started by WNYC, and we worked with different community organizations that were already up and running and had the teen populations there, rather than us going out and finding them. But are you thinking you would like to do this yourself, kind of create a radio diary kind of thing?
Sure. Like, I'm better at talking than writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are a couple of thoughts I have about that. You could just start recording a diary. Carrying a tape recorder around with you and recording parts of your life. But the thing is that it's helpful if you have another ear to help you kind of edit things down and put it into a manageable form and try and form a story. It's sort of like if you were writing, you're a short story writer, for example, as somebody, or I'm sure more people in the audience might be, that you are kind of writing down ideas, but you have to edit it and edit it and edit it and put it in a form, and you have to figure out some kind of narrative arc, something makes sense. So generally it's good to talk about a particular topic, or a particular thing that you're trying to do to give it some sense of the moving now, so it's not just a personal diary. And it's encouraged, part of the great thing about that is that it is this uncensored self in some sort of way. And the hard thing about it is it's many hours of work that turns into something. I have a couple of ideas of resources. Can everybody hear me, by the way? You can go to transom.org or air.org. Transom is a radio production help site where people who are interested in making radio. It's run by Jay Allison, who produces The Mom. He's been making brilliant radio for a really, really long time. That's one place where you can go. Or AIR, Association of Independents in Radio, and they give you some ideas about getting started. And honestly, this is a really interesting time for independents in radio to be making stuff, because there are so many different channels, there are so many podcasts, there are so many places looking for content. So I absolutely encourage you to maybe start looking at those kind of sources. Or to think about what you want to do a diary with, and maybe find somebody. I know Eric Matt teaches at Landmark College, who does radio production. He may have some ideas for you of the thing is you got to find a place to play it if you want it to be a broadcast. And you could also go to Teen Diaries. Just look at the stuff that they've done there. And youth radio. I think those are a couple of the places to start. Hi.
So, I love what you were saying about the low-income communities. In particular, I live in the Detroit area, and basically, pretty much exactly what you described is like what's there. In particular, there has been a very, very large growing independent software development community growing in Detroit and there's something that's essentially unacknowledged, except for those who know about it. And it's been spreading mostly through internet communications and through a variety of means, in particular on IRC, as well as independently hosted internet radio stations. And it's just going to say, I wonder what you thought about the use of internet radio as a means of, although it's sort of narrowcasting and broadcasting, it does have the potential to reach a very wide audience.
First of all, the Detroit example is such an interesting thing because a lot of stuff is generating out of there. I know huge community gardens, kind of, people who are software entrepreneurs and other kind of entrepreneurs moving into these old buildings. And I just think, it's amazing what a transformation is going to go on there and how people are kind of creating something. A phoenix is rising out of the ashes, or at least trying to get it off the ground a little bit. But I have actually heard a story on NPR about the software development companies in Detroit. I love internet radio. I think it's awesome, and it's also the scariest thing in the universe to me. Because the traditional broadcast model for public radio and public radio production anyway is that we get money from our listeners who listen to us, and they listen to our pledge drives, and they feel loyal to us, and they pay for programming. Have you ever paid for anything on the internet? Just asking you. Okay, you have. The demographic that you belong to generally doesn't.
There are many things I'm not paid for.
So the thing is that, all of this stuff is being made for free. We live in this free culture, this idea that information should be, I believe that information should be free, but, the work of artists, the work of musicians, I think that's a little bit more challenging. But nonetheless, so what the thing is that, people who used to be loyal to public radio and help pay for it, now they have so many different choices to listen to, and they can get everything for free. And there's this idea that you don't have to pay for things anymore, which I think is going to be a real challenge for public radio in the future. There are a lot of people who are experimenting in different ways with click to pay or pay for play or that kind of thing. Some programs and podcasts do that, but you have to have a real following. You have to be really popular, and people have to be able to find you. I love the idea of narrowcasting to sort of certain populations, and that's one of the amazing things about the internet, that, like 50 years ago, if you were a lone stamp collector in Indiana, you would be the lone stamp collector in Indiana. And now there are ways to kind of find people who share the kind of things that you like to do all over the place. And I think it makes people feel connected. And I think that's a really great thing. So narrowcasting, sort of making a radio program that not a lot of people are necessarily going to listen to, but a lot of people may find you because there are those communities of interest everywhere. And I'm so glad that there is media that's good and available for them. I do wonder how are they going to learn to pay for themselves. I really do. I wonder this whole sort of, like, everything is free culture. I don't know how it's going to sustain itself. Hi.
Hi there. You touched on the busyness, the growing busyness in our lives, and then how that relates to the demand of committing to listen to a piece, even if it's 5 minutes. And with sort of the modern expectations of multitasking in our lives, I wanted to ask, sort of, in partly like an ethical thing or just an attention span thing, is there tasks that we can do that are constructive contextually that we can do, whether it's like a craft or things you've experienced personally, that while you're listening you can be both receiving the listening and feeling like you're doing something that relates to it. I don't know if it would mean to be taking notes. I mean, I guess it's a question at what point does it take away from your attention instead of adding to it. But just, that question.
Somebody here thinks you might have an answer.
Oh.
I have done this. This may not be your cup of tea. Something you're doing with your hands, embroidery. Weirdly enough, I think carrying the plot and embroidery at the same time.
Nice.
It works. I've heard, what was it, whittling? Can you do the same thing? It's a little more manly.
Well, I wonder about that. When I'm thinking about, I don't think listening has to be, you sitting here and just listening to each other like this. I mean, I think you can listen while you're cooking with somebody. I think that some of the greatest conversations I've had is when I'm driving somewhere with somebody or going for a walk. There's something about that, when you're walking, you're side by side, you're not facing each other, and it gives you a kind of freedom, I think. Sometimes you can say things that you may not normally surface when you're staring someone right in the face. I think that the kind of act of careful listening is a little bit, for me, it's the idea of sort of intention, that it's actually there. It's hilarious that my boyfriend is here right now. I probably wouldn't say that I'm the best listener in the universe, but I do try. And I think what I'm saying is that you sort of, I think it's about kind of looking around the world in a new way, in a way that sort of has wonder for, what is out there? What are these stories? Instead of seeking the stories that we want in this very, I only want the information that I want coming into me that I know, you know, that it's so neat, you know, it's so sort of manageable. And I think we, in many ways, are limiting the surprises in our life like that. Do you know what I mean? That's sort of like, I'm only going to listen to songs that remind me of this song. You know what I mean? That sort of, I guess that is my concern for myself, that I don't narrow my options by only listening to things that I think are going to be interesting, but just keep a little bit of a different ear out. Does that answer your question, or are you thinking about it specifically? And by the way, you just reminded me, last week I interviewed this woman from the Exploratorium where they do the makers, they have this makers workshop, and I learned about anatomy, and it's this woman who's a great artist. She knits like, you know, like medical chart. You know, you'd see a medical chart of what do they call them? And you have a
cross-section.
Yes. Then she knits them in like 3 dimensions, or you know, like it's fantastic stuff. But it's worth looking at, and you can aspire to knit like that in the most manly of ways. What is it? It's anatomy. AKNIT. Look it up. Hi.
This is a question and an observation. Some years back, I listened to a political talk on a radio, and I had friends watching on TV, and we had both the same quote political leanings, and they heard it so much differently than I heard it. You
So
know,
interesting.
it's like, so when you're like you use your hands a lot, right? And I use my hands a lot when I talk. But how different it is to not have a visual, you know, when quote listening.
Have you guys ever heard that first Nixon-Kennedy televised debate?
Yeah.
You know,
I was about to quote this.
yeah. But, you know, like, there's Dick Nixon, kind of sweaty, kind of uncomfortable looking, and suave, you know, JFK in his little seat. And the people who saw it on television thought Kennedy won, and the people who heard it on the radio thought Nixon won. So interesting. But I think you're right. I mean, I guess that's what I'm saying. You know, that we take it in differently when we're listening. And I'm not just sort of making a play for radio. I'm sort of making a play for audio in general, which I think is disappearing because you want to capture people's attention. You need video. That's what we're hearing all the time, you know, sort of like the 3-minute story. That's the only thing that goes viral. Video does not go, audio does not go viral. That's what a lot of people have been telling us, the experts.
Some people were attributing the breakdown in Congress to the lack of conversation, and I guess in previous years, people of opposite sides of the Republicans and Democrats would, even though if they disagreed politically, they'd go out for a drink together, or they'd go out for lunch together. And apparently that doesn't happen anymore. And so that so even though the people are rivals, they've lost that sense of conversation and having a cordial relationship with each other. So.
You know, I've heard very similar things. In fact, Chris Matthews, in his book about Tip O'Neill, he talks about that very thing, that, you know, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would pat each other on the back, and the sort of idea that, you know, yes, in the public sphere they would be enemies, but they were all close to each other. They all knew each other. They were friends with each other. Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to spend Christmas with her family, with Anton Scalia's family.
Right.
I mean, that just blows my mind. But I think that sort of idea that your position didn't define who you were, you know. And I was actually listening to something. Gosh, what was it? See, this is the thing about listening. It all flows together in some kind of way. But you know, it was a guy who wrote a book. He was one of the founders of the Tea Party. And he was just interviewed this morning on Morning Edition, and the name of his book is like, Don't Hurt Me and Don't Take My Stuff. And so that was the name of the book, and he was saying, you know, she was asking why the Tea Party was known for being so obstructionist, and he was sort of saying, it's our principles, you know, our principles are greater than anyone else's, and I'm not saying that they have no more right, you know, I'm not saying that at all. But it feels like that is where the fraction is. It's the splinter part, it's the It's the parties from the extremes that are sort of pushing that if you are a Republican, you can no longer sit with a Democrat and have any kind of conversation because you will be perceived as, less Republican or less fighting for somebody. And I think maybe they need to Allende. They could use some role playing or play acting. But I think this is a conversation, sort of like where to go with this. Like this morning, I was interviewed on your local community radio station in Brattleboro, and he was saying, "So how do you listen better?" It's like I don't have a prescription for it. I feel like this is a practice, that all of us can do with intention. And he also asked, there were very good questions, like, well, what about in this kind of social space of Facebook where people are not really talking to each other? How do you solve conflicts that way if everyone isn't in the same room? But, I know that people are talking about sort of conflict resolution spaces online, and I don't know where they go, I don't know how they work, I don't know if... One thing I will say is that when I was working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was working with the Riverside community. They had been, Harvard had been encroaching on them for 100 years as far as they were concerned, and they'd been fighting really bitterly since the 1960s about parking spaces and public land use and this kind of thing. And, they had loads of arrows in their quivers to just throw at each other. Harvard and Riverside had been for years. So I worked them instead of going to these town meetings, sort of meetings with Harvard rather, talking about what they wanted, to talk about what their story was. Just like keep it really disciplined. Nobody was to ramble on. We sort of practiced doing 2-minute story. This is what my neighborhood means to me. And they did that. And it was amazing. The whole tenor of the meetings that I had been to before completely changed. It was at least a conversation. And I continued to work with them, on a couple of different projects, but they've just gone off, but, they're doing their own thing now. But they feel like that brought something to the table that could change the conversation. And I don't know, if it's a fix, but it is a way that you perceive the argument differently. You know what someone's interest is, I guess, what their stake is. I think, Jeff, are we out of time? Is it 8:15?
Maybe one or two more questions.
Anybody else have a question? Hi.
I just have a quick curiosity question. There was a slide, I think it was in Sierra Leone, of man with a hand amputated. Was the other one who had a transplanted hand?
He did not have a transplanted hand. I have seen pictures. I took that picture, so I actually know that one. The other ones are the child soldiers and that kind of thing, by the way, from the UN High Commission for Refugees. Just want to give credit there. No, it was not. It was not. I'm sorry that I turned off the presentation. But I actually have seen in Sierra Leone, when I was looking for photographs last week, there are some people there with prosthetics, but they're extremely crude-looking prosthetics. It doesn't seem to me that the sort of advances that are being made in prosthetics for especially people who were former combat soldiers here are being made there by any means. I did see sometimes people had this kind of straps that had, they weren't full-fingered, but they were like 2 pieces of metal that were kind of clamped together that just could open. It was a
That's called a prosthetic. They're actually the first functional prosthetic design.
So, no, he didn't. But he told me the most heart-wrenching story, oh my God. He actually, in his village, he knew it was happening. They had a line of people at the stump, and they, had guns on them, or people were threatening them. And they would say, to people in front of them, short sleeve or long sleeve? I'm not kidding you. Cut above here, a couple over here. And he knew it was happening. There was no other way it was going to happen. And he took off his wedding ring and he put it in his pocket. And when he woke up many, many hours later, he just passed out, like a lot of people did. He didn't get an infection. It was really an amazing thing that he did because he was in the bush for a while, probably for about 2 weeks after that happened. But, now he has this, he showed me his wedding ring. It was a pretty amazing thing. But, his only crime was living near a diamond mine. It was just heartbreaking. Anything else?
I wanted to know if you had any tips for balancing
face-to-face interactions and the demand of screen-to-face daily, just kind of time necessary that it takes to like pay attention to all of the details.
Wow. If I had that, I would write a book and make it. You know, I, like everybody else, have a hard time like pulling myself away from the recap of True Detective. Gotta watch that, or gotta read that before the night is through. I mean, I have to read a lot for what I do. I have to do a lot of online stuff. So I feel like I've deserved a break by doing something else. But, you know, they talk about kids, they say no more than 2 or 3 hours a day of screen time. And that to me sounds like a lot. I think that maybe it's about the quality of the screen time. You know, what are you looking for? What are you seeking? What are you finding? Are you just experiencing other people's experience? Or are you finding ways to sort of create or expand your own? I don't know, I never think about this in that kind of way. Or, you know, I do think about it, but in a sort of like, oh my God, I've got to get this done, so I better stop doing this. You know, that's kind of how it goes. But I think that idea of, you know, sort of like watching what you do and saying, I had 4 conversations this week with people that were more than, hi, how are you doing? I'm going to try and have 5 next week, you know? And whether that means calling somebody that you actually haven't spoken to for a long time, or just reaching out in some other kind of way, I think it's about connecting. And I think it is, you know, maybe it would be enjoyable for you to go to StoryCorps and look up some topics that you think might be interesting and listen to people. And maybe that inspires some other part of you. I like what Sherry Turkle said about like not controlling everything that comes into us, connecting to the messiness. And sometimes that means you're walking across a burning bridge and talking to somebody that you haven't talked to for a very long time. And you have to have that conversation that might be a little